book, The Politically Incorrect Jesus. Joe, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you, as always.
Let's, if we can, get into this, because as I said before you joined us, we have heard a lot more about political correctness in this world because of the campaign, and whether it's Ben Carson or Donald Trump or whatever. When we interviewed you back in March, this was an issue, but we were thinking about it more on what's happening on the college campus. But we're seeing it a lot in this campaign, aren't we?
I think you're seeing that more than any other issue in one sense, because everybody is saying that is the underpinning, really, for much of the mindset that goes on behind how people act. And so when I was listening to the debates the other day, Ted Cruz basically said exactly what was in my book. And Donald Trump has been saying, well, that and many other things, but yes. And Ben Carson, of course, the same way. So we're beginning to see this played out, as I had, obviously said when I began writing this sometime last year, that this was going to be an issue. So here we are.
Here we are. When we talk about political correctness, I'm coming up to a break, so you're a good radio guy. You know how to maybe give you an answer in 90 seconds or less. How do we define political correctness?
Well, I define it as the chic moral ideology of the day, which is advocated in the public square by the self-appointed gatekeepers of our discussion and our narrative. And so to understand the roots of political correctness, we don't have the time today to go into that, but basically, here's one thing to look for. It was created to have an us versus them mentality because it was started in 19th century Europe to help the poor people fight the oppressors as they understood them to be. And so the things that were dominant then kind of filtered down to our society in the 60s. And so the hallmark of the politically correct agenda is to create an us versus them mentality. And we see that happening in our culture today, where it's liberal versus conservative, or Democrat versus Republican, or black versus white. So whenever you begin to see people saying it's the problem in our culture is somebody else other than me, then you begin to sense that there's this whole politically correct agenda has begun to take hold, and that's the big issue that we look at today.
We'll take a break, continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What is the relationship of elections to culture? Many Christians argue that elections are downstream from where real change is taking place. Oftentimes, politicians and judges are making decisions to catch up with the culture. Mark Steyn understands this. He writes about this in his book, The Undocumented Mark Steyn. He explains this in his New York Post article. He says the real battle for America is over culture, not elections. His argument is simple. Culture trumps politics. In many ways, politics is merely the reflection of cultural change. Now, he does acknowledge that you can't have a conservative government and a liberal culture, and that's the position the Republican Party is in. He goes on to explain that liberals expend tremendous effort changing the culture. Conservatives expend tremendous effort changing elected officials every other November, and then they're surprised that it doesn't make much of a difference. So try this as a thought experiment. Imagine that some of the candidates you supported who lost their elections actually won. How much difference do you think their election would make as the cultures become more secular and anti-Christian? There might have been a few less assaults on religious freedom, but the impact of a single candidate on many of these cases might be negligible. What would be the impact on a culture that has accepted same-sex marriage? Again, there might be a small impact, but the cultural trend continues. Mark Steyn concludes that if the culture's liberal, if the schools are liberal, if the churches are liberal, if the hip, groovy business elite is liberal, if the guys who make the movies and pop songs are liberal, electing a particular candidate isn't going to make a lot of difference. Now, this isn't to say that elections aren't important. Elections do have consequences, but the lesson here is that culture trumps politics. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking today with Joe Battaglia, and I might just mention that we have a link to his website, thepoliticallyincorrectjesus.com. You can find out more about him. Also, there are a number of videos that we have a link to as well, so that you can watch that and be a little more educated about this idea of political correctness. You talk about the politically incorrect Jesus, and obviously that is to be an antidote or a counterbalance to political correctness. So talk, if you might, Joe, about how we are to do that and how we are to think about this as Christians.
Okay. Our role model as Christ followers is, of course, Jesus. And he is always the North Star, which means, of course, he is the one we always follow. He is our true north and our center. And culture is always trying to take us away from that, simply because, for the obvious reasons that, and I think you expressed it well in the op-ed piece you just did on the air, that it is culture, not politics, that really drives how most of us think and what most of us feel. And when the culture begins to shift away from the kinds of principles that Jesus espouses about self-sacrifice for the cause of the greater good, for instance, or adhering to biblical principles which really make for better citizenry, a better informed public, and so forth, you begin to find that the culture will really make a strong effort to get us away from the things that Jesus stood for. And so we have to be very careful about that. And I think we can stand up for what we believe as Christians, as believers, and do it in such a way so that people understand who Jesus is. And this is what I'm particular about in the book. Our government is not our savior. I make a statement in the book that when we raise the flag higher than the cross, we begin to have a problem. And I think we as believers need to understand where real power is, how real change works. And I think we all understand that real change is when the human heart is changed. We can change all the individuals we want to who hold political office, but if their hearts are not changed, then not much is going to happen. We can change the kinds of movies and pictures we see or the kind of books we read, but if the people who write those things or create those things do not have the right heart and the right spirit that they put into that work, then what comes out of it will not necessarily be good for us either. Mm-hmm. So I think if we begin to understand all that and begin to see, well, how would Jesus respond? And what I say is that Jesus always rises above politics and the polemics to get to what he is really about. And it's really about who he is and how we raise him up and how we communicate his truth to the world. And I go through several examples in the book, and maybe we can talk about those if we have a moment.
Sure.
So that we can get an idea of how that might work in our own lives.
Well, one of those is in Chapter 5 on common ground, because right now, as people listen to this, they're thinking, okay, I'm going to have my dukes up and I'm going to kind of fight for these issues. But you're really talking about the fact, and I love how you even have the introduction on the opposite page. Righteousness without tears is arrogance. I'm afraid the world has seen too much of our righteousness and too few of our tears. Or put another way, we're real good sometimes with our biblical convictions, but not so good with our aspect of biblical compassion. And both need to come together, truth and love. True?
Oh, absolutely. And I think what's confused the world a lot is they have seen a lot of righteousness without our tears. And the whole common ground chapter that you allude to for the listener's sake is an opportunity I had about 10 years ago to be in Washington, D.C. I was invited down by members of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party because we had created a model called Redeem the Vote. And that was sort of like the alternative to Rock the Vote, where we had young people of faith register to vote. And we did so in a very creative way back then, and it got their attention. And they invited us down to talk with them about finding common ground with evangelicals. And so I went down, and this one particular story of us being entertained in a very nice Georgetown brownstone, and there were many interesting individuals there, some of whom you and others might know if I mention their names. And one gentleman during the evening asked me what was the evangelicals' middle ground on abortion. And I said, well, there is no middle ground on abortion because we cannot have middle ground on something which is just basically and so inherently part of our belief system that all life starts at conception, and only God can interfere with that continuum. It's not up to us. And he threw up his hands and said, see, there's no talking with you people, meaning evangelicals. I said, well, I think you're asking the wrong question. I didn't go after him and then, create a debate. I wanted him to understand that the question is not middle ground, which then asks us to compromise on things that we cannot compromise. That's not compromise. That's a sellout. I said what we really need to do is find common ground, not middle ground.
Yes.
Common ground suggests that we both keep to what we believe, but is there some intersecting point where we can agree and work on that level, and therefore that would make much more sense. And he thought a moment and said, yeah, I get that, and we had a wonderful conversation from there on in. So Jesus, I'm sorry, yeah. I just want to say that Jesus tried to find a common ground with people. And again, I can cite some examples that, maybe we can do that in a minute or two. But it's always about trying to find where Jesus can fit into the conversation, and so that we have a place at the table where Jesus can show up. And if we just continue to argue or battle with people, that is never going to allow him a place at the table, and that's what I'm really about.
Well, again, you talked about Jesus and the Samaritan woman, and of course you even talk about the fact that Jesus prefers that we choose to be around those who are different from us. The natural tendency, and this is not just true of Christians, I think it's true of all people, we tend to be around people that we like, tend to people that generally agree with us, tend to be around people that aren't going to attack us, criticize us, make fun of us. So it's understandable, but if we're going to be the salt of the earth and light of the world, we can't stay in the salt shakers, can we?
Well, you can't, because it's not really what salt does. The reality is that Jesus asks us to go into environments which need us, which need him. And the only way to do that is to be in situations with people who don't know him. And certainly with people who don't know him, they're not going to agree with us. And so we have to get to the point of feeling comfortable and even wanting to be in those situations and going against the thing that we naturally want to be, which is safe, secure, and comfortable. And Jesus never calls us to be any of those. He calls us to go where he leads us. And I liken also in another chapter where I liken us to sometimes we're fertilizer, where we like to clump together to the point where we never spread out to enrich the land, which is what fertilizer does. And when you clump together as fertilizer, if people have ever worked in a garden situation, there is an aroma that comes downwind from that, which is unpleasant. And so the reality is that Christians were designed not to be together, but to salt the earth, and as I say, to fertilize the earth. We gain strength from being with each other in fellowship, but we gain opportunity when we spread out to find and be in situations like I was that night, where people don't know you and don't believe what you believe, because how else are they going to hear about who Jesus is? And so, I think situations, when we take time to be with people who are different than us and be in situations that aren't exactly to our liking. I mentioned a particular incident there, and, with the woman caught in adultery. They brought her to Jesus, and they, being the politically correct police of his day, the Pharisees, to them. And the opportunity he had was first not to the politically correct police, but to the situation that he found himself in, and that was before the woman who needed love and forgiveness and the kind of love that only he could give. So it's up to us to figure that out, trust God for an answer when we're in those situations.
The concept of learned helplessness. It's when a person faces a problem so large that he or she finally gives up and says, there's nothing I can do. When a Christian is tempted to say that, or when we say it, it is music in the ears of those who hate God. But for those who follow Christ, the Creator, Sustainer, and Sovereign Ruler, there is always something we can do. I'm asking you right now to take a step toward making a positive change. One step. If you do that, and another listener does, and another, we're on the way to a bunch of changed lives, and together, those changed lives will change the nation. It starts here with your decision right now to step up and join with Point of View by sending a year-end gift. Look for the Changing Lives, Changing the Nation banner at pointofview.net or give using the Point of View radio app, pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Thank you for stepping up. Point of View will continue after this.
We clearly live in difficult times, especially for Christians. Sometimes it feels like the culture speak up with compassion, but we need to speak up with truth in the way that Jesus did. That's one reason why I'm a big fan of Point of View, is they're dealing with cutting-edge, controversial subjects that the church sometimes doesn't want to deal with. But they do their homework, they do it informed, they also do it in a way that's practical so we understand the issues but know what we can do about them. Kerby just asked great questions. It's clear that he understands the issues, it's clear that he's informed, but he's also thought about the issues biblically, but wants to help people understand what can they actually do about it. One of the reasons I think Point of View is so valuable is because they just deal with the cutting issues of the day in a manner that's informed, in a manner that's gracious, and in a manner that's making a difference. So if you want to make a difference, especially today in our culture that's becoming increasingly hostile in some ways to the Christian faith, Point of View is standing up for truth, and they need your help.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us today Joe Battaglia, founder and president of Renaissance Communications, and author of the book that we've talked about in the past, but wanted to bring him back again, The Politically Incorrect Jesus, Living Boldly in a Culture of Unbelief. I've heard so much about political correctness in this political campaign. And Joe, you were talking about this idea of really common ground. We aren't obviously going to have middle ground with people with whom we have great disagreement, but we are going to maybe have common ground on lots of issues. And it seems to us that Jesus is really challenging us to go out there. And even what you talk about, look for truth in dung heaps. I thought that was kind of an interesting comment.
Well, I guess it could be, and that's in context of that chapter on entertainment.
Sure. And you said that was the most difficult chapter for you to write since you're in the media. So I'd love to get some of your comments about that, because we are consumers of media. Of course, we're in the media. How do we develop a kind of biblical discernment in that regard?
Well, that's a good question, Kerby. And I think here's where we have to be very particular, and I'll tell you how I dealt with it early on. As someone involved in the media all my career, now over 40 years, as a broadcaster and as a journalist, I developed early on my own working biblical definition of what journalism and communication was, so that I had a plumb line by which I could assess the real efficacy of my work, right? So I knew, and basically what I found out, that my role in culture and in society as a communicator was to help bridge this understanding between what I was trying to communicate and the people that I was trying to get that message across to. And so the biblical words, the Greek words that come up from that are koinonia and logos, which is to establish a commonality with someone in koinonia, and the logos, of course, used as a term for who Jesus was, meaning the highest form of truth. So in essence, my responsibility is to look at the social landscape, which is what I'm called to do as a communicator, and interpret that for people. It is to look at it and be as accurate as possible, be as honest as possible, take no sides, facts in front of them, and is do it in the right spirit so that I'm trying to get across to them what exactly is going on. And so if I don't do that, then I become what I call a thieving ideologue. And I think we see a lot of that in the media today. And it used to be that people at least thought they were being, quote, objective, and acted like it somewhat when they were reporting on things or writing about things. That is no longer the case. It is so plain and obvious on both right and left at this point what one believes, and not only how they believe it, but they are snarling when they say it. I don't think that's what we're supposed to be about as believers when we are engaged in the media. I always have to question, why am I doing something? Do I want to be inductive? Meaning, do I want to put something into the story that's not there in order to get across a point or my own position? Or do I want to be deductive, which is, I think, the real issue, which is to deduce or to pull out from the story or anything I'm communicating what is actually there. Honesty, that I deal with this in that way. And so I think as someone in the media, I have to then go and look at myself from my point of view, as a Christian. Am I doing things that are only going to make me look good or make God look good, quote, until I realized that God does not need a defense attorney, and how ludicrous that is to think that any of us need to actually defend God and defend his name. Now, we want to stand up for his name, right? And we want to stand up for what we believe as Christians and as Christ followers. But we don't need to argue and get so incensed over things that we begin to not be gracious and winsome in the way in which we approach people. And I think that's always an important thing to realize, that God is bigger than any media network that wants to either downgrade the role of God in the culture or do anything negative that would downplay what a Christian's position is. My job is to reflect who Jesus is in every situation, wherever I am. And so if I do that, then I'm fulfilling my responsibility. And I think it's up to then God and the Holy Spirit to then work it out in people's lives. When I speak for truth, I lift up Jesus, because he really is the only one that will draw people, as he said. When he is lifted up, he draws all men to himself. You notice that he didn't say, when we lift up his best representative. So I think also that's why we're seeing in some of our movies today that I get to work on a lot, many of our faith-based films, particularly from our friends Alex and Stephen Kendrick. Mm-hmm. We saw what happened in War Room, and we saw what happened in all their other. Something happens, something mystical, something Hollywood can't put its finger on. There is no template into which we can put God's presence and the Holy Spirit to work the same way time after time. But when we are true to what our calling is, and when we lift up the name of Christ, and we are not ashamed of it, because it is the power of God unto salvation, things begin to happen. And as someone involved in the media, I want to make sure that, number one, I'm accurate. I am in my intent and in my communication. I'm not looking to have to defend God, because he needs no defense. My role is simply to act in love, come as a servant. Hopefully, that righteousness is with tears and not with arrogance. And I lift up the name of Jesus, and I do it in a way that people can understand rather than people can fight me for. And then things begin to happen that are totally outside of my control. And I just, how God works things out. And so I've seen a lot of that, and it's a lesson I learned a while ago, and I'm trying to implement, and I hope that something in the book communicates that as people read it. So, long answer to your question, but I hope it made sense.
Well, it certainly does. And again, about 170 pages. Let me just, before we run out of time here in this segment, talk about how people could use this. Political correctness is really going to be on the scene, and this book maybe came out a few months earlier than it was needed, because now I think everybody would like to read the book. We talked about it back in March, but if people wanted to maybe read it, maybe make it a part of a small group study or a Sunday school class or something like that. Joe, talk about how people could use this book, because we, again, have a link to your website, and they can order copies, and also you have a number of videos that people can watch as well.
Yes. I mean, I've used it in small group studies as well, and basically I've created an 8-part Bible study that people can just download for free off the website, thepoliticallyincorrectjesus.com. And I have 10 videos that I also put together answering questions from the book that they might be able to use as well in a small group study or a Sunday school class. And I really would like people to use it in a way that they get into, how do I respond to the politically correct culture in a way that makes sense? Because I think a lot of people are just plain tired of all the nonsense of political correctness. Basically, it asks us to people, and not just, quote, Christians or conservatives, but a lot of people are just saying, this is just nonsense. You can't say the truth anymore about anything. I just wrote an op-ed piece a couple of weeks ago that was printed in the Christian Post about why political correctness is now becoming dangerous in light of not standing up and defining and saying what radical Islam is doing to us, why we don't confront it head on and call it what it is. And I use my own little story. Father watching The Untouchables when I was a kid, and being of Italian-American descent, my father complaining about all the new guys that were put into the...
They're all Italian. Yeah, I remember that.
They're all... Yeah, and he was saying, why do they have to be Italian? And I turned to him and said, Dad, probably because they were.
Because they were. Good piece.
So, anyway...
Again, let me just mention that people can find some of this material at thepoliticallyincorrectjesus.com. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We're talking with Joe Battaglia. Bible study guide, so that this would be available to anybody that would like to use this in a small group or a Bible study or things of that nature, right?
Yep. They can just go online and grab it off of there, and I've had over 500 downloads so far from what my publisher tells me, people using it in that regard.
And again, you got 10 videos. We've got the Bible study as well as some of the other resources. Of course, people can order the book. And like I said, I'm glad the book came out because we are now dealing with political correctness up to our eyebrows. And I apologize. I think we kept you on here a little bit longer than we promised, but I don't think you minded. And it was just great to once again reconnect with you. And we'd love to encourage people to find out a little bit more about what political correctness is, how to apply a biblical perspective, and make sure that you don't get caught up in the world, because we're not supposed to be taken captive by the culture. We're not to be conformed to the culture. We're to renew our minds in Christ Jesus. And certainly, Joe, I think your book does a great job of helping us do that.
Well, thanks, Kerby. Always good to talk with you, and I hope your listeners continue to pray and think about all that you give them, because it's very vital stuff, and you're always there on the cutting edge. And so thank you again for having me on.
Well, thank you for letting me keep you a little bit longer. Again, Joe Battaglia, and again, you can find out a lot more about him. We have his picture there, so click on the See More button. That will tell you about him. We have a couple of links, one of those to the actual book, and then you can also find some of the videos there. I would certainly think that if you've been maybe having people talk about political correctness in your church or your Sunday school class or small, good to have him back again, just to talk a little bit about some of these issues, especially during this political campaign, and so much of it has come up. Let me just mention that tomorrow we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about ISIS, but as a kind of a preview for that, I did post a couple of articles. The first one I mentioned at the start of the program, McCarthy, an individual that actually was one of the prosecutors for one of the individuals for actually the first attack on the World Trade Center. And he asked a very important question, and that is, if you were a moderate Muslim or even a Muslim who was devout but rejected violent jihad, is there anything that I could say, anything a video would say that would convince you to join ISIS? And he goes through this long list of all of these kinds of things, and he said, I didn't think so. And then he goes on the second page to say, what I understand is that Washington would have you believe that that would be the case. He said, whether it's President Barack Obama sputtering on about how Guantanamo Bay, which I won't go through the long list, you are led to believe that a violent jihad is something that a Muslim would choose if indeed they were offended by something someone says, by something that was in a video. And he says it's not just from Libya, Egypt, and most recently in his book Spring Fever, it's still the Republican gospel glibly peddled by Marco Rubio that just a couple of weeks ago, the, again, fairy tale would go something like this. There is a terrible dictator who has so tormented his people that they rose up against him. They were noble people, overwhelmingly moderate secular Muslims, adherent of a religion of peace, or as Secretary of State Condi Rice put it, a religion of peace and love, who craved democracy. Interesting enough, he said, sure, the noble people may have tolerated the occasional jihadist in their midst, but that would happen even more well-intentioned, moderate, peaceful moderate as well. But let's let bygones be bygones. Or Democrats, there tends to be sometimes this mindset that there are certain things that will drive people to join ISIS. And I think this piece by Andrew McCarthy, and I've not done it justice by only reading part of 2 of the pages, and so I encourage you to read it, because he really is asking a fundamental question as to whether or not we should accept the statements being made sometimes in the Republican debates, sometimes in the Democratic debates, often in the Democratic debates, I guess I should say, that this particular action, fill in the blank, is what is driving people to become radical Muslims, and that is simply not the case. We spend some more time tomorrow talking about this, since we'll have an ambassador that's going to be really addressing this issue for us, is by Lawrence Kudlow. Now, usually when I quote from him, and it's rare, I mean, in almost 30 years of broadcasting, I think I've quoted him 2 or 3 times, but when I do, it's usually about economics. Well, this one is sort of economics, but the point he's making is that if ISIS is the wealthiest terrorist organization in the world, then perhaps the best way to defeat them, apart from obviously the need for some military action, is to bankrupt them. In other words, to cut off their funding. And so he has some very important concrete things that can and should be done so that ISIS is no longer the richest terrorist organization in the world. And so those are some things that we'll probably spend some time tomorrow talking about, because we really wanted to, as we end this year, address some of these issues. And I might even mention that at the end of this week, we're going to do kind of a year in review. And this is going to be an opportunity to hear from Colonel Alan West and from Debbie Georgiadis and probably Penna Dexter. We're going to see if we can get Kelly Shackelford by phone and maybe some others to really just talk about what are some of the key stories of 2015. But no doubt one of the most important stories is the story of ISIS. And so we're going to spend some time dealing with that tomorrow. Second hour today, we will get into this issue of apologetics. Wanted to give you a chance to once again learn not only how to articulate your biblical faith, but how to defend it. But I might just mention we're coming to the end of our year. And this is very important because, as we have even talked about in the past, this is a time when many ministries raise a fairly significant amount of their support. Kelly Shackelford, a week ago, Friday, actually said in their case, I think 30% of their support comes in December. Point of view is quite not like that, but still, I hope that you will consider what you might do to support your local ministries in your community, your church, of course, your Christian radio station, if it raises funds and the rest. But I hope that you'll also consider what you might do to support Point of View. Over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about how changing lives can change the nation. And I mentioned Kelly Shackelford. Here's a man who was listening to Point of View when he was in law school and came up with the idea that, maybe I could actually defend religious liberty in the courts. I've told you the story about Lee Weaver, individual. This fall, I had a chance to speak at his crisis pregnancy center, but back in the 1980s, his family said, if we're really concerned about abortion, what are we going to do? And they started a pregnancy resource center. We've talked about Rodney Hare, who began to be more and more concerned about what was happening in the public schools and listened to Point of View and saw some of this unfolding in the lives of his children and started what today is known as Liberty Christian School. And Jeremy Dice has been on this program with us as we've talked about some of his defense of various religious liberty issues. And first grew up listening to Point of View in the backseat of the car. And of course, a week or two ago, we had a video of Vicky Garza talking about developing the campus ministry that she does because of listening to Point of View. And if you go to Changing Lives, Changing the Nation, you'll see the video today is with Sean McDowell. In the second hour, as we talk about apologetics, certainly you can't think about apologetics without thinking about Josh McDowell and Sean McDowell, and he talks about the importance of supporting this ministry as well. So let me encourage you, if you could, as we even go to a break right now, to visit the website, pointofview.net, and click on that button that says Changing Lives, Changing the Nation, and encourage you just to take a minute to make a gift to Point of View, because the life you change through your gift would help change a nation. And also, you can watch the video. And if you are receiving the emails that we send out on a regular basis, I would encourage you to respond to that email. We're dependent upon your financial gifts, and if you can help us at year end, we would greatly appreciate it. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk more about how to defend the Christian faith. That coming up right after this.
Have you ever heard of the concept of learned helplessness? It's when a person faces a problem so large that he or she finally gives up and says, there's nothing I can do. When a Christian is tempted to say that, or when we say it, it is music in the ears of those who hate God. But for those who follow Christ, the Creator, Sustainer, and Sovereign Ruler, there is always something we can do. I'm asking you right now to take a step toward making a positive change. One step. If you do that, and another listener does, and another, we're on the way to a bunch of changed lives, and together, those changed lives will change the nation. It starts here with your decision right now to step up and join with Point of View by sending a year-end gift. Look for the Changing Lives, Changing the Nation banner at pointofview.net or give using the Point of View radio app, pointofview.net, or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Thank you for stepping up. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. As we say so often here, we're helping you to be able to articulate a biblical point of view as well as know how to defend a biblical worldview. That second category is what is oftentimes referred to as apologetics, how we defend the Christian faith. And today we're going to spend a little bit of time in the first hour getting back into that topic and really raising some very good questions. One of those questions is, what about this complex world that we live in? After all, a religion that is thousands of years old, how can it possibly give answers to a complex world that we find ourselves in? And then even as we give answers, are we sometimes limiting what we do, in that maybe we oftentimes give answers that are based upon logic, philosophy? As important as that is, would it also be helpful to have individuals with different perspectives also helping us understand the gospel? We've talked about this before. The International Society of Christian Apologetics, the president that appeared there before me was actually somebody who had worked in cults. The one is now currently the president, actually is an English teacher. And we recognize that philosophy and logic are important, but there's a lot more that comes to that particular discussion. So we're going to spend some time today talking with Dr. David Skeel. The book is entitled True Paradox: How Christianity Makes Sense of Our Complex World. We have information about him and a link to his website, and we'll get into that in just a minute. He is a professor of corporate law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, author of a number of books, has received a number of awards over the years as the outstanding teacher in the various courses that he teaches. You perhaps have seen him in the past on NewsHour, Nightline, or Hardball with Chris Matthews. Perhaps heard him on National Public Radio, maybe have read him in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. He also is a frequent speaker for the Veritas Forums and is an elder at 10th Presbyterian Church and blogs at trueparadoxblog.com. We have a link to that on our website today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me.
We appreciate your good work. I might also mention that we posted one of these articles that appeared in the New York Times, and I called it Christian and Atheist Bond. We'll talk more about that in just a minute, because there are some great ways for people to get to know you a little bit better. But I know early on in the book you talk about when you were writing the book, somebody asked, well, you're going to make it simple? And you sort of paused and said, well, actually, just the opposite. I'm going to talk about how Christianity relates to a very complex world. And that's really kind of the theme of the book, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And when I had that conversation, it was a real oh no moment for me. Am I completely wasting my time? But as I go on to say, unfortunately, I didn't say it in that conversation. Everything that I'm talking about is quite straightforward, but it really is about complexity and some of the complexities of how we experience the world.
Well, and I think one of the things I mentioned just a minute ago is early on in your introduction, you talk about this idea of logic, and you're quoting from an individual. Matter of fact, I've had many people that would be identified as apologists or theologians who address these issues, and he kind of gives a logical syllogism. But the argument that you're making, and certainly it's one that we've talked about on this program before, is in some respects using a world, but a lot of people say we're sort of in a postmodern world, or that works well for people that are kind of into philosophy and theology, but a lot of people come from the arts or from experience. And I think really the theme also of your book is that there are different ways that we can defend the gospel, and we don't have to rely just on logic and the philosophy that is oftentimes used as the kind of classical apologetics.
I think that's exactly right, and I really like the way you put it. I am critical of simple, logical attempts to prove the existence of God, but I don't at all want to say there's no place for those kinds of arguments. They can be very, very effective, particularly in the kinds of worlds that you were talking about among philosophers and in areas like that. But there are a lot of folks who do not respond to that kind of argument, and I really do think that we need lots of different tools in our apologetics toolkit, and I'm trying to develop a particular different set of tools.
And I think you've done a very good job. Let's see if we can for just a minute. You talk about losing the truth in court, and you give a quote from Alan Dershowitz, who was on the program with us recently when we were talking about what's happening in Israel. But when you talk about whether it's a quoting from Alan Dershowitz or Philip Johnson or some others, you're a lawyer, and sometimes using that court illustration might help us understand what you're trying to get at.
I do talk a lot about courts and about justice in the book. The particular part of the book that you're talking about is another place where I'm a little bit critical of strategies that we often are tempted to use and often find congenial. And the particular strategy here is what I refer to as a Darwin on trial strategy. It's the kind of strategy Philip Johnson used in a very powerful book called Darwin on Trial. But my warning there is it's really important to keep in mind when we use courtroom metaphors and we try to argue like lawyers that criminal trials are not designed to produce truth. And so what we're pointing towards when we use criminal lawyer techniques is not truth. It's jousting, and it's trying to undercut the other side's argument. So I think it's really important to make sure that at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to pursue truth and to persuade the people that we're talking to that we care about truth. We're not trying to pull the wool over their eyes or try to knock them off balance with clever lawyerly arguments.
Right, and I think a lot of our listeners would understand that because you use the example of Trayvon Martin. Since then, we could add Michael Brown and a whole long list of others that have come out, actually, since your book has come out, to have a lot of people say, I'm not so sure justice has been done here. I'm not so sure that we actually arrived at the truth, because we're talking about the preponderance of evidence, and if there's not enough evidence, you must acquit. If it does not fit, you must acquit. All those kinds of things. And I think a lot of us recognize that if our ultimate goal is what is true, and is the Bible true, and can I provide at least some concrete evidence to my skeptical friend that it is true, using the kind of courtroom metaphor doesn't work so well, because they might say, well, yeah, okay, but you haven't really convinced me. If it was a court of trial, I'd call you not guilty, but I wouldn't necessarily be ready to make a commitment. And I think that's an important part of that metaphor, isn't it?
Absolutely, and there sometimes is a temptation to think that if we win an argument, we've won. Yeah. But that's often not the case. The point is not to win an argument. The point is to show people the persuasiveness and the truth of Christianity.
And we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to focus a lot of time and attention on this book. It is called True Paradox, How Christianity Makes Sense of Our Complex World. It is published by InterVarsity Press. If you would like to order one, we have a way in which you could perhaps do that. We also have a link to the website, trueparadoxblog.com. And for those of you that like to read blogs from very intelligent and discerning individuals, certainly let me commend that to you. And if you click on the website there where his picture is, it will give you information about him and a link to the website. He's got a number of things more recently on such things as differing perceptions of Ferguson and issues about suffering and the Hong Kong protest and much, much more. So I think you will appreciate that. We also have the article that appeared in New York Times. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And we'll get back and talk about some of those people that have been critical of Christianity, whether it's a Christopher Hitchens or whether it's Steven Pinker, and maybe some lessons we can learn there as well. Trying to put some tools in your apologetic toolbox. We'll continue doing that right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What is the relationship of elections to culture? Many Christians argue that elections are downstream from where real change is taking place. Oftentimes, politicians and judges are making decisions to catch up with the culture. Mark Steyn understands this. He writes about this in his book, The Undocumented Mark Steyn. He explains this in his New York Post article. He says the real battle for America is over culture, not elections. His argument is simple. Culture trumps politics. In many ways, politics is merely the reflection of cultural change. Now, he does acknowledge that you can't have a conservative government and a liberal culture, and that's the position the Republican Party is in. He goes on to explain that liberals expend tremendous effort changing the culture. Conservatives expend tremendous effort changing elected officials every other November, and then they're surprised that it doesn't make much of a difference. So try this as a thought experiment. Imagine that some of the candidates you supported who lost their elections actually won. How much difference do you think their election would make as the cultures become more secular and anti-Christian? There might have been a few less assaults on religious freedom, but the impact of a single candidate on many of these cases might be negligible. What would be the impact on a culture that has accepted same-sex marriage? Again, there might be a small impact, but the cultural trend continues. Mark Steyn concludes that if the culture's liberal, if the schools are liberal, if the churches are liberal, if the hip, groovy business elite is liberal, if the guys who make the movies and pop songs are liberal, electing a particular candidate isn't going to make a lot of difference. Now, this isn't to say that elections aren't important. Elections do have consequences, but the lesson here is that culture trumps politics. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. David Skeel, again, professor of corporate law at the University of Pennsylvania, author of this book, True Paradox, How Christianity Makes Sense of Our Complex World. David, there are a lot of things I like about your book, but one of those is that you take on some of the arguments by people like Steven Pinker. I mentioned his name just a minute ago, and we'll explain who he is. But in the past, it seems to me that a lot of people will take on the so-called new atheist, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens. I mentioned his name just a minute ago. But I've been very concerned that you have a whole set of literature. As a matter of fact, you can go into almost any bookstore and go into the psychology section and have all sorts of books written by individuals that say, you know, there's really just a brain. There's no mind. There's no mind. There's no spirit. There's no soul. Everything is material. What you think are rational decisions that you are making, you're really just dancing to the DNA in you. You're dancing to this meat computer called your brain. And it seems to me that this is a very significant challenge, and your book does as good a job of any to begin to address that issue and to begin to think about how we would respond.
Well, I certainly appreciate your compliment. I do think that this is a hugely important issue, and the context I would put it in is a lot of these books come out of evolutionary psychology, and there's a sense of excitement in the world of evolutionary psychology, and a lot of the excitement is just along the lines of what you've just said. It's we're just a brain, and now we can figure out all of the reasons why we do the things that we do, and I talk a lot about these arguments in the book. One that I don't talk about in the book that has been really striking to me is what psychologists are finding really reflects the view of the world that you get from Christianity in some respects. One of the most striking things is they would never use the word original sin, but that's what they're discovering. But they're discovering it in a way that to them seems to exclude Christianity. And so I think it's really important to show that Christianity is explaining, it speaks to the same phenomenon and speaks to it more persuasively, in my view.
Well, in your first chapter, you talk about ideas and ideas making, and that is this idea of consciousness. And again, let me try to represent that view, and that is you have this meat computer. We now have done enough neurophysiological studies to figure out that you're just simply following the neural impulses in your brain, and you think you have free will, but you really do not. And there really is no spirit, there is no soul, there's no heaven, there's no hell, there's no sin. It is all part of a biological evolutionary trend that has brought you to this point. We as Christians have some pretty good answers for that, don't we?
We absolutely do. And the part of that materialists like Steven Pinker, who, as you mentioned, I talk a lot about in the book. He's a very bright guy and has some very interesting ideas. A materialist like Steven Pinker, and really nobody else, and everybody else who's coming from a materialist perspective, simply can't explain why we have the mental capacities we have. There's just not a plausible evolutionary explanation for why we have the rationality and the ability to think that we have. Christianity teaches or gives us very good explanations for these things. Christianity teaches us that the heavens declare the glory of God, so that suggests the universe is rational. It reflects its creator, and Christianity teaches that we're made in the image of God. So it's, from a Christian point of view, no surprise that we have the rational mental capacities that we have. And there's some other illustrations I give of this that I think are really remarkable. And my hope is that even a materialist, even somebody like Steven Pinker, would have to say, wow, that's kind of interesting, even if he's not persuaded.
And you talk about the University of Ideals. We've had, of course, people like Ravi Zacharias on. He believes the moral argument is very powerful. And if you think about that, you can go anywhere in the world and find a set of moral desires, moral standards. Now, they get perverted because we recognize, because we're in a fallen world, you can go to places where treachery and deception are virtues and where cannibalism is seen as a standard practice. So I understand that they get really perverted, but still this idea that there are certain things that are right and certain things that are wrong. A child at a very young age says, wait a minute, that's not fair. You promised. I mean, there's a sense in which we seem to have a lot more than just basic biology going on in our brains.
Absolutely. And one of the most difficult things for a non-Christian, or what I would call a science without God perspective of the world, one of the biggest difficulties for that perspective is explaining where these moral longings come from and what the basis for them is. Even if you can identify them and show similarities across cultures, you can't explain why they compel us and why they are so central to who we are, whereas obviously Christianity can. That's what Christianity is all about, or a big part of what Christianity is about.
Just before I leave that chapter, though, let me ask a question I'm sure you hear as an Ivy League professor. I know I did hear it in the Ivy League as well. Why are Christians so bad? In other words, if these ideals are so good, why do we have slavery? And, of course, have addressed that on the Probe website. I've got a whole week on slavery, a whole week on the Indian Wars. We've done stuff about the so-called Yahweh Wars. Of course, we've even had various guests on the program talking about some of the dark periods, either of American history or of Western culture. But that is an argument used very much by, say, a Christopher Hitchens or others that, of course, even Bill Maher, we played one of his clips just the other day, who will just simply say, well, you can't believe Christianity because it endorses slavery and it certainly is allowed for the oppression of women and on and on. How do you respond to that?
So the first thing I think we need to say as Christians is we need to acknowledge that Christians have done awful things through the ages, and it's very important to acknowledge our sinfulness. And the first part of my answer would be nowhere in the Bible does it say that sin automatically disappears when we embrace Christ. We are still fallen. We are still sinful, although hopefully we're in a process of sanctification. So the first thing we need to do is acknowledge the sins that have been committed in the name of Christ. The second thing I would say, however, is that Christianity is not responsible for those sins. And the thing that is so remarkable about Christianity is what I refer to as self-correcting. Problems in the past, such as slavery, may take a long time to work out, but they are inconsistent with Christianity. They are not part of Christianity. Christianity is self-correcting, whereas if you take another set of views like Marxism, often the terrible things that are done in the name of Marxism are consistent with Marxism. The things that are done in the name of Christianity are not consistent with Christianity, so that even though Christians fail, over time, those failures will work themselves out because of the self-correcting nature of Christianity. It's one of the truly remarkable things about the gospel.
And the other thing I would add to it just before I take a break is sometimes you see these individuals painting with a broad brush. You know, when you have so many of the so-called new atheists say religion is dangerous. Well, I mean, first of all, even for our Muslim friends, it's not fair to paint all Muslims with the brush that certainly applies to the Taliban or ISIS. It certainly is not fair to say all of religion is dangerous when you talk about terrorists. So obviously those categories matter as well. But let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into the issue of the arts. We've already talked a little bit about human consciousness, but what about this idea of beauty and the art? We'll get into the issue of suffering if we have time, and the issue of moral codes and some others. This is all part of a book to really kind of identify how Christianity really is relevant to this complex world. And Mark Knoll, in his endorsement, said, Christianity, which is so simple that a child may understand and believe, is also filled with complexity. Those who have sung with Isaac Watts, When God, the Mighty Maker, Died, know that they live much that cannot be explained simply. David Skeel's unusually thought-provoking book offers, on one level, a careful response to literature from the new atheists, but on a deeper level, it explains why trying to understand the complexities of Christian faith may leave those who make the effort lost in wonder, love, and praise. I'm going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into the question of art and beauty. So those of you that are artists, I want you to see how you can certainly use your particular area and expertise to do some of this, and then we'll talk about issues of suffering and justice, and certainly do our best to cover as many of the topics in this book as possible. But if you would like to read more about it or read it itself, we have information on our website, pointofview.net. Simply click on the See More, and that will give you not only information about David Skeel, but also about his website. We have an article that came from the New York Times, which we'll talk about a little bit later, of his relationship with an atheist and how that has unfolded as well. And we encourage you to visit the website, get some of those articles, and find out more about how to make the case for Christianity in a complex world. We'll be right back.
Have you ever heard of the concept of learned helplessness? It's when a person faces a problem so large that he or she finally gives up and says, there's nothing I can do. When a Christian is tempted to say that, or when we say it, it is music in the ears of those who hate God. But for those who follow Christ, the Creator, Sustainer, and Sovereign Ruler, there is always something we can do. I'm asking you right now to take a step toward making a positive change. One step. If you do that, and another listener does, and another, we're on the way to a bunch of changed lives, and together, those changed lives will change the nation. It starts here with your decision right now to step up and join with Point of View by sending a year-end gift. Look for the Changing Lives, Changing the Nation banner at pointofview.net, or give using the Point of View radio app, pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Thank you for stepping up. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Primarily kind of a sit back and listen interview, but if you'd like to join us, we certainly will take your phone calls. Dr. David Skeel with us as we talk about his book, True Paradox, How Christianity Makes Sense of Our Complex World. And you have a chapter there on beauty and the arts, and I think it's first worth mentioning that Christianity hasn't done a very good job sometimes of addressing that in the modern world, but we'll give credit to Francis Schaeffer and Hans Ruckmacher and Nancy Pearcey and others. But the issue of art and beauty another very significant challenge that we, I think, as Christians can respond to. But take us through how we would begin to think about applying a Christian view to the arts and how we could answer some of the questions and objections of the skeptics.
So the starting point for me is pointing out how puzzling our experience of art and other forms of beauty is for a materialist, for someone like Steven Pinker. So every one of us, I think, has had an experience of transcendence in the presence of a beautiful landscape. For instance, I talk about an experience I had
in the Redwoods,
hitchhiking out west back when you could do that. And most of us had similar experiences in the presence of beauty in music or in painting. This experience is almost impossible to explain from a materialist point of view. And so when you look at the materialist explanations, the kinds of psychological explanations that we were talking about earlier, they say things like Steven Pinker in one of his books says that the things we find beautiful in landscapes, or the landscapes that we find beautiful, are landscapes where our ancient ancestors would have been able to find food, so that our mind is structured in such a way that the things that we think are beautiful are places where there are food. Now, this isn't a completely crazy explanation, but it strikes me as pretty wildly implausible that when you think of the things that you respond to in nature, they're not often places where you would likely go looking for foods. And I go through some of the other explanations for art and why we experience art as beautiful, none of which is particularly compelling. If you turn to Christianity, on the other hand, what Christianity says is that characteristic feeling we have in the presence of beauty, a sense of just extraordinary transcendence that C.S. Lewis wrote really beautifully about, but often accompanied with a sense of melancholy and a realization that the experience is temporary. What Christianity says is we're right to feel that way about beauty, that the world is beautiful, it was intended to be beautiful, but it's been corrupted, and it has fallen. And so that feeling we have is something that is true to the nature of the universe. And Christianity obviously goes on to promise us that one day those feelings of transcendence will characterize all of the creation, but for now, the reason we experience beauty the way we do as both transcendent but somehow incomplete or tinged with melancholy is because we live in a world that's been bent.
Sure. And one of the arguments that is made, and I think Stephen Jay Gould's the one that makes it, is, well, art is just sort of a byproduct of a big brain. So everything from the paintings of Rembrandt and Renoir and the music of Bach and Beethoven, well, it just kind of, flotsam and jetsam in the brain. I sometimes want to say to our skeptical friends, don't you have a better argument than that one?
Absolutely, and that is precisely what Stephen Jay Gould said about art. He says it's just an accident, it's just a byproduct, and it just seems really unlikely that something that's so central to our experience as human beings and gives us so much meaning is simply an accident.
The other part of that is, as I mentioned at the outset, one of the things we recognize even at the International Society of Christian Apologetics, and I've seen this at other places as well, is the value of people that are in the arts. And for example, the current president is an English professor, and we've recognized that even in some of the conversation we'll have in the second hour when you talk about sexual issues and things like that, sometimes the best way to really begin to have an influence is to sort of even bypass the mind and the logic and to go through feelings and through moral convictions and things of that nature. And I think today we recognize how profoundly influencing movies, television, books, theater, things of that nature might be, simply because they sort of bypass some of the logic which we have been using as Christians as kind of the only tool in our apologetics toolbox.
I think the role of the arts is extraordinarily important, and there is a tendency, I think, and it's a natural tendency, to assume that truth is about a set of simple logical propositions, and that's all there is to truth. But that's not the way we experience the world, and it's not the way God created the world. We're told repeatedly that part of the truth of the world is its beauty, and that we can't fully understand who God is and what the universe is like if we don't have a sense of beauty to go along with the descriptions of how the world was made and what it's like. And I think artists and musicians and poets really can be helpful in that in that area, and I think probably all of us have poems or songs or paintings that we turn to when we're thinking about a particular issue or something that's central to our experience of the world.
Dr. David Skeel with us. We talk about his book, True Paradox. Just before we take our next break, let's maybe focus a little bit on suffering and sensation, one of the shorter chapters, but still very significant because in the secular world, in the secular mindset, the argument of the new atheist is there really isn't evil. It just is. There isn't any suffering just happens because we live in a world that is red in tooth and claw. We've been able to escape some of that, but we still all live and die and become dirt. First of all, that isn't very encouraging, but second of all, there is a sense in which, and I don't want to be cavalier about this, that there can be meaning in suffering, and a Christian can understand that in a way, say, a materialist cannot.
Absolutely, and one of the things that's so striking to me about the kinds of arguments that a Richard Dawkins or even a Christopher Hitchens may make and made is they do suggest that suffering is simply part of the natural order, but none of us responds to suffering that way. All of us feel that suffering is somehow wrong. And a nice illustration of that for me is Richard Dawkins. He's talking about a wasp that paralyzes a caterpillar so that the wasp larvae can eat the caterpillar alive. It's this awful scene that Charles Darwin talked about a lot. And what Dawkins says is, I don't know if the caterpillar can feel pain. I devoutly hope that it can't. And my question to Richard Dawkins is, why is that? Why does it seem so terrible to you that a caterpillar is eaten alive? And the answer Christianity gives is because it's wrong. That's a manifestation of the brokenness of the world.
Well, and I think in terms of suffering, we can talk about the suffering of the Savior on the cross for our sins. Again, this, I think, is connected in some respects because if suffering has any kind of meaning, if suffering is wrong, then that seems like there's a moral law to the universe, there's a moral order to the universe. And then, of course, that brings us to the argument that if indeed there's a creator, that might affect me and the decisions that I make. So a lot of this is connected in a way that I think most people maybe have never really understood in terms of suffering, creation, God, certainly the crucifixion and the resurrection all sort of come together in some way or another.
Absolutely. And on a personal level, for someone who is experiencing suffering, I can't imagine anything more comforting than knowing that God suffered in the same way we suffered. Christianity is the only religion, the only system of thought that is based on a God who suffered right alongside us, which is a great comfort, I think, for those who are in suffering.
That'll bring us to our conversation right after the break on the issue of justice, because a lot of people say, well, you know, there's no justice, there's no right or there's no wrong. But if indeed you think that some things are wrong, well, then what about justice? Because after all, there are some people that seem to do evil and get away with it, and others that seem to be good people who suffer terribly. And unless there's an ultimate justice, that's a question. So we'll put that on the table. We'll come back and talk with Dr. David Skeel about that. His book is entitled True Paradox. It's published by University Press. I think you will really enjoy the conversation that he has with us throughout the book. About 170 pages, a very easy read in some respects, but also getting into some deep thoughts and dealing with the complexity of the world. So if you'd like to know more about him, like to read a little bit more about some of the things that he is involved with, we have also a link to his blog, which is trueparadoxblog.com. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with him right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, if you'd like to know a little bit more about Dr. David Skeel, you can certainly go to our website, pointofview.net. Of course, we have a link to his blog, trueparadoxblog.com. We also posted an article from the New York Times because I thought it was a fascinating article about you and Patrick, I don't know how to say his name, Arsenault, I guess it is. And here you got a theist and an atheist, but you are, in a sense, good friends, but obviously come to these discussions with very different kinds of perspectives.
Absolutely, and interacting with Patrick over the course of writing the book was one of the biggest shaping influences on the book. It helped me to see what kinds of arguments many atheists are likely to find persuasive, which ones they don't find persuasive. He really challenged me on some of the arguments and ideas that I was presenting. So it really was a wonderful and is a wonderful relationship. I've not yet persuaded him that he needs to accept Christ as his Savior, but we've had wonderful conversations over the last several years, and it's the kind of conversation I hope that will become increasingly frequent in our culture. And one of the nicest things that's happened since that article came out for me is I got an email from an atheist philosopher a friend of mine from the Midwest saying he wished he had played the role that Patrick played. He wished that he had been talking with me about these issues, and he wanted to know if we could talk about them going forward. And I, of course, said I would love to.
I think a part 2 is coming up, if nothing else. So let's see if that works out.
Yeah.
That would be great. Let's, before we get too far along, get into this issue of what you might call the justice paradox. And early on, you even talk about America's justice paradox. You talk about the framers of America's constitutional experiment were more clear-eyed and realistic than the founders of almost any other system, certainly better than Marxists and others. And that is something that we need to understand, because the strength of the American system was based upon the idea that we believe people have rationality and virtue because they're created in the image of God, but we're also concerned about ambition and factions because people have a sin nature. So they found a way to distribute power in such a way so that ambition counteracts ambition. I'm kind of quoting, if you will, from Madison, so that you end up with that. Well, this issue of justice is very important. Marxists think they have an answer. Materialists think they have an answer. Pantheists think they have an answer. But the only really good answer is one that comes from a Christian understanding. True?
Absolutely, and you've just articulated a lot of what I think Christianity tells us about justice. One of the things it tells us is it's not just ordinary citizens who are sinful. It's also lawmakers and law enforcers, and you need a system of checks and balances so that the law enforcers and the lawmakers don't have too much power in the same way that you need rules to punish crimes by ordinary citizens. So that is one really important set of insights Christianity has into justice. Another set of insights that Christianity has into justice are around the idea of human rights. Lots of people say they're in favor of human rights now, and I believe many non-Christians care deeply about human rights, but Christianity provides the only firm foundation for a vision of human rights. What Christianity teaches us is that each of us is made in the image of God. No matter how bright or not bright we are, no matter how physically able or not able we are, we're all made in the image of God. That turns out to be a very different vision of human rights than a secular vision of human rights. So it's another area where Christianity has really deep but simple insights into the nature of justice, it seems to me.
And back to your point there, because I have some people that will misunderstand that. You know, for example, sometimes skeptics will say, are you saying that I can't be good without God? No, but I'm saying that you as a Christian have a basis for being good and an understanding of what goodness is. Likewise in human rights. Are you saying that I can't support human rights if I'm not a Christian? No, I mean, you can support human rights, but the foundation, the basis for human rights really is found in Christianity. So certainly you could talk about human rights abuses and you could be concerned about sexual trafficking and the rest. But if you're talking about, do I have a philosophical, theological foundation for a belief in human rights? Well, Christianity provides that, and it's pretty hard to find it anywhere else.
It's really true. And when non-Christians do try to develop an objective basis for human rights, it looks a little different from a Christian understanding of human rights. So the most common secular explanation of human rights, or the basis of human rights, is that our human rights come from our consciousness, and in particular from our ability to plan out our lives. And when you violate somebody, when you interfere with somebody's ability to make plans for their future and plans about their life, you're interfering with their human rights. And there's a certain amount of truth to that, but what that suggests is that people who don't have an ability to plan out their lives are not as valuable as people who do. So babies are not as valuable as ordinary people. The folks who have mental incapacities of various kinds are not as valuable as other people. And what Christianity says is we are all equally valuable because each of us is loved by God, no matter what our capacities or incapacities.
And I might just mention, your last chapter deals with life and afterlife. And of course, we need to give reasonable arguments for why we believe there is life after life. But again, this is one where you see all sorts of evidence, even apart from the Bible, of life after life. And so we need to obviously be able to defend that. But it's an outstanding book to really help us understand how Christianity can make sense of our complex world. And so I appreciate you writing the book. And just before we let you go, let's talk about what is on your blog, because I do encourage many of our listeners to not only get the book, but to follow the blog that you post on a regular basis, dealing with all sorts of very important issues from a Christian point of view.
So I really appreciate your mentioning the blog. I also appreciate your mentioning that the book is 170 pages long, because people might think it's 1,000 pages from what we've been talking about. But on the blog, I really talk about whatever strikes me. So very frequently, it's issues related to the book, issues about justice, or about Ferguson, or about the Hong Kong protests. It's also issues about the arts and about poetry, and it's really anything that strikes me. So it's really fun to do, and it leads to a lot of interesting conversations. And there's a lot going on in our culture right now. There's a lot of things that I don't have the answers to, so a lot of what I'm doing is just thinking out loud and trying to bring a Christian perspective to bear on these issues.
Well, I appreciate the good work that you do, not only, of course, at UPenn, but through the Veritas Forum and Attends Presbyterian, and certainly through your writing, your blog, and appreciate you being on the program. Let's do it again sometime.
Thanks, Kerby. I would absolutely love to be on again, and thanks for taking all this time with me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview. And again, just as we come to the end of the program today, I want to once again encourage you to visit the website, pointofview.net. So while you go to the website, talk a little bit about some of the resources that are there. We talk about this from time to time, but it would be good to once again focus on all sorts of things that we want to try to provide to you so that we can educate you, so that we can equip you and empower you to make a difference. The first is my Viewpoints commentary, and we make that available to you. And if you aren't already receiving it in your inbox, you can go and sign up for it. You're going to find that very helpful as you look at various issues and have the documentation for some of the things we talk about. So first of all, go to the Viewpoint section and find some of that material. Of course, we have our Take Action section, and from time to time we do give you some action items so that you can go out and take the material that we have been talking about and use that in a very effective way. Don't forget that we, of course, are dependent upon your financial gifts to keep this program growing, and so anything that you can do to help us out financially would be greatly appreciated. Well, that's all we have for today, so let me again encourage you to visit the website, pointofview.net. Let me thank Andrew, Catherine, and Chris for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Have you ever heard of the concept of learned helplessness? It's when a person faces a problem so large that he or she finally gives up and says, there's nothing I can do. When a Christian is tempted to say that, or when we say it, it is music in the ears of those who hate God. But for those who follow Christ, the Creator, Sustainer, and Sovereign Ruler, there is always something we can do. I'm asking you right now to take a step toward making a positive change. One step. If you do that, and another listener does, and another, We're on the way to a bunch of changed lives, and together, those changed lives will change the nation. It starts here with your decision right now to step up and join with Point of View by sending a year-end gift. Look for the Changing Lives, Changing the Nation banner at pointofview.net or give using the Point of View radio app, pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Thank you for stepping up. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I'm constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.